Like at its core, you can think of Quarto as a large set of default configurations and customization options that we are orchestrating for calling this other program called Pandoc.
And you may well wonder what Quarto is that one of my guests, Carlos Scheidegger, is talking about. Quarto, it turns out, is the new kid on the block when it comes to scientific publishing, and together with Carlos and his two colleagues Christophe Dervieux and Gordon Woodhull, I'm trying to find out a bit more about it, what it's used for, what it does, and where it's going. It's only a year ago or so that I began to notice that some presenters at conferences and workshops use a tool for the slide decks I've never heard of, a tool called Quarto. And as is often the case when it comes to technology, I got a slight attack of FOMO, the fear of missing out. But to be fair, Quarto hasn't been around for that long. In fact, the tool was introduced to the public just 3 years ago with an announcement by the CEO of a company called Possit, Joseph J. Allaire. Well, Quarto seems to have struck a chord with some researchers and engineers, and this is probably down to the fact that Quarto is open source, and there are scientists and engineers who want to promote the use of open source software, but the fact that Quarto is strongly connected with R Markdown, R being the programming language, also helps a little. Still, it can't be easy to introduce a new tool in a space that's already a little bit crowded, not least with highly successful commercial publication and presentation tools and apps. But scientists and engineers are a demanding bunch, aren't they? And in particular when it comes to sharing and publishing your work and research results. For years, people have been using LaTeX for writing scientific articles, like yours truly, despite the fact that LaTeX is rather unknown to a wider public. And increasingly, there is a demand on including code in text, so that you can get something called a dynamic or active article. That is, articles from which you can run code directly and dynamically create or change tables and figures, for instance. And so we've seen a number of solutions coming up, and you probably heard some of them, like Jupyter Notebook and, yes, now Quarto as well. So when I saw a message on the UK RSE Slack channel asking, why on earth do I not do a podcast episode on Quarto, I contacted the team. And a short while later, earlier this year, 2025, I found myself sitting opposite Carlos, Christophe and Gordon in our common virtual meeting room. A room not without some networking hiccups, but in the end we managed to spend a good while talking about Quarto and what it brings to the table. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Carlos, Christophe and Gordon now.
I'm Carlos. I'm principal software engineer at Possit, and I've been working on Quarto for 4 years, it turns out, officially as of yesterday. Someone gave me a happy 4-year anniversary, so I guess it's exactly 4 years.
Okay.
And for the last year and a half or so, I've been the technical lead for the Quarto project. Before joining Possit, I was an academic. I was a professor in computer science.
Okay. Christophe.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christophe. So I live in France, and I'm an open source software engineer at Possit. It's been now 5 years. And so previously, before Quarto, I worked on the R Markdown ecosystem that we may mention today. So I'm mainly R developer initially, and now working full-time on Quarto directly.
And finally, Gordon.
Hi, my name's Gordon. I have a background in visualization, and I'm the newest member on the team. I've been here about a year and a few months, and I've been working on types and dark mode mostly.
In a nutshell, what exactly is Quarto? What does it bring to the table?
Our website says the Quarto is an open source scientific and technical publishing system. So what does that mean?
Exactly.
So the way I think about it is that it's a system. So it's a command line application, but you can run it from your IDE, from VS Code, from RStudio, from Positron directly. But it's fundamentally a command line application that lets people author documents like presentations, blog posts, technical articles, manuscripts, PhD theses, mixing code and prose in a way that makes it very easy for people to reproduce their results. So if you need to rerun again because your data changed, it's very easy to do that, and you don't risk things like copying and pasting the wrong table into your results, or sort of realizing that, as things change. And so we support programming languages like Python, R, Julia. Any programming language that has a Jupyter kernel is supported in Quarto. Quarto has first-class Jupyter support. We'll get into it, as well as two other ecosystems that are quite popular. So one is the R Markdown ecosystem through Knitr that Christophe has long been a primary author of. And the other one is a pure Julia ecosystem that sort of folks that use Julia tend to have sort of all of their infrastructure in Julia. And so one of the third-party contributions into Quarto is a pure Julia way to run Quarto documents with Julia code. And from there, you can generate PDFs, presentations. You can publish them on to GitHub pages, into Netlify, into our own publishing system called QuartoPub. So that's very easy for you to publish. So from Quarto, you can go from authoring to previewing to publishing, all sort of within the same.
You mentioned quite a number of things that you can do with it. What's the most common use of Quarto? Or is there such a thing as a most common use?
So I will have to guess. One of the things that we believe fairly seriously is that some folks do quite sensitive work with Quarto. So Quarto gets used inside companies that do biotech research, that do pharma research, and they very much value the privacy of their data. Even sort of folks working at a university that are working on sort of a sensitive manuscript would probably not be very pleased if there was telemetry, so that like someone knows what the document is being authored. So we take that very seriously, and we don't collect telemetry on usage. So we have to sort of give you a guess for what we think are the most common uses. And I think weblogs, so sort of like technical blogs that use code to explain things, are quite popular. And I think folks use that quite a bit. And presentations, like you said.
Christophe.
Yeah, writing books is also a common use case with Quarto. So there is a bunch of technical books that initially some other colleagues at POSIT has used Quarto to write some books, but now some of the community. So some editors like allow to have Quarto to be used for book writing. This allow to have like an online book version that is available usually, and then you can produce the output that will be like converted, edited to books.
I know there is something called Jupyter Books, not only Jupyter Notebooks, but also Jupyter Books. Because I think you just mentioned earlier that there is a link between Quarto and Jupyter, and that you can go directly into a Jupyter book, or is Quarto book something different than a Jupyter book?
So they are very comparable. So the kinds of things you can do with Jupyter Book are very much the kinds of things you can do with Quarto when producing a book. So both of them are systems for taking like a large number of documents, collating them into like a website or into something like EPUB, which is a traditional format for publishing books. The difference with sort of Jupyter Book is that Jupyter Book is 100% centered on the Jupyter ecosystem. The input must be a set of Jupyter notebooks with variations. There's sort of syntax variations, but more or less you're working within the Jupyter ecosystem. If you're in Quarto, you can write a book that's entirely in R Markdown, right? Sort of entirely in the Markdown variant that doesn't use Jupyter. You can use Quarto books that are purely Jupyter notebooks. So the latest edition of the Pandas book was authored using Quarto, but all of the content is in Jupyter notebooks. It's just using Quarto as the mechanism for turning that into a book for the publisher. And you can even do things like mixing and matching content. So if you have a book that is about data science more generally, and you have part of the exposition in like Python and part of the exposition in R because you want to highlight different things, Quarto makes that very easy. And so part of the book is going to be taking like the Knitr ecosystem to compile the document, and part of it is going to be using Jupyter. But they're very comparable in terms of the general task, which is taking these computational documents and collating them into a book.
So when you create a presentation, I did that recently with Quarto. I thought I eat my own dog food when I do an interview about Quarto. There are different ways in which you can create it. You can, for instance, use Reveal.js, or you can use different modes. So under the hood, there is a lot going on that brings together different technologies. When we lift the lid of Quarto, what is it that we're going to find? So, it's a broad question, I know.
No. This is an excellent question. Like at its core, you can think of Quarto as a large set of default configurations and customization options that we are orchestrating for calling this other program called pandoc. So pandoc is a system that takes a large number of document formats as input and produces a large number of document formats as output. So Quarto uses pandoc very centrally, so very importantly, like in the middle of its processing. And so the ability to generate these different formats comes in large part from pandoc. So pandoc is a fantastic sort of like gem of software development that you can author as input, not just Markdown like Quarto, but you can author it with Markdown, you can author LaTeX directly, you can author like input HTML, and you can make output be LaTeX with Vue.js, PDFs, sort of a very large number of outputs as well. What Quarto does is it provides defaults that make sense for folks who are authoring computational documents, right? So we execute the code, we make sort of the right kinds of defaults and options for those. And then we set it all up and then call pandoc to get the output. And then we do a little bit of post-processing. But you can think of Quarto as an orchestrator, very large one, but something that like coordinates the many different ways that people want to call pandoc when they're using it for like computational documents. Pandoc is its own binary that we ship. So it comes with Quarto when you have it. It comes inside Quarto. You don't have to install it yourself. And the part that does the orchestration is written in TypeScript. So it's sort of a command line TypeScript application that calls pandoc inside it. And so that's how the technical split happens.
You mentioned that you're the technical lead, I think, Carlos. So Christophe and Gordon, could you explain what your roles are?
I'm a software engineer. I've been in the field for more than 30 years. So I love learning languages, and I've actually gotten to learn Haskell and TypeScript and Lua for all in the past year and a half. Mostly I was working with types for the first part, and I actually got to contribute to pandoc a little bit to help translate from CSS to types so we could get nice looking tables. Now I'm working more broadly to the dark mode functionality.
Just as a little bit of extra context, Typed is a new system for generating PDF files, much like TeX and LaTeX.
Okay.
Right? So, but it's a much more modern interpretation of the same idea of writing some text, and then it produces a PDF that's very, very well formatted. It's a beautiful system.
Types.
It's called TYPST, as in Typest.
Typest.
It's very hard to pronounce. And it's a beautiful system. It's an open source system as well. And pandoc produces typed output. So now Quarto can use that. And so Gordon has been working on a lot of fantastic tech. When he says, "Oh, I've been working on CSS," he's really selling it short. It's like a beautiful piece of technology that translates all of the styling system in HTML, which is what libraries like the Pandas table styler uses. It emits HTML, which means that by default, you can only use it in HTML documents. So we created a system, I mean Gordon, that converts all of the styling information in HTML to sort of this format agnostic version of it, and then can actually translate it into a PDF document. So if you use Quarto, you can take all of these table styling libraries, like the table styler that comes from Pandas, the one that comes from Posit publishes a number of these, but they now work across formats. So you can use them in HTML, and you can also use them in PDF. You can also use them in Typest.
Gordon, you were also mentioning dark mode, and I think you referenced it twice. Could you quickly explain what that is?
Well, so it's funny that this has only happened in the past 5 or 10 years. That it's become such an important feature just to be able to have light text on dark backgrounds pretty much in every application. So we wanted to support that for our users. The hard part here was doing it for plots, because there's dozens of different plotting libraries. And so we had to come up with a system that would work across languages where you could prepare 2 versions of each plot, with your light styles and with your dark styles. Very simple, obvious thing, but very, very useful, and makes it easier on the eyes for those of us who prefer dark mode.
Well, I mean, it sounds very simple, but it probably isn't very simple, is it, when it comes to the nitty-gritty bits? Christophe, so we haven't talked to you about your contribution to Quarto, and what do you do there?
I've been at Posit before Quarto started, and I started as a software engineer for the R ecosystem with a tool that is called R Markdown. And basically, R Markdown is the same as Quarto, or was the same as Quarto, but R specific, so only targeting R users. And Quarto is built upon the 10 years of experience with that, and so I contributed to those things. And so today I play a big part in the integration with NeatR and the R ecosystem in Quarto. And then I also worked on some specific features. So I worked a lot on the presentation feature in Quarto, so Reveal.js integration update. But then it's a lot of smaller to medium things. So we split the work usually. So Carlos is a technical lead and so make the decision on the big features. But then we have our own. So Gordon works on types, dark mode. I worked on Reveal.js presentation. I did also some features. And the three others are also maintaining the whole open source infrastructure. And so I do a big part in like the testing infrastructure, which is quite important, automatization. We use GitHub and things like that. We use only open source tooling and not like company infrastructure or things like that. And so we need to maintain that also, like it's only the three of us. So I do a lot of those things too. And then like it's usual open source project, you need to do like a lot of debugging, research, community contribution. And so it's also part of the work. You can't do only new features. So
you're actually leading us to kind that I want to talk to you about next, which is how you run this as an open source organization. Because you mentioned now POSIT, which sounds like a company, or what is it actually? Seems like this is the kind of organization behind Quarto. Am I getting this right? Or what is it?
Yes. POSIT is the company that employs the three of us as full-time engineers. POSIT used to be called RStudio until a few years ago. So we're the developers of RStudio, the IDE that you might have heard about, that sort of lets folks use R and author documents. We still author and still work on RStudio. It's still being actively developed. But we also, as a company, have accepted and realized that for lack of a more subtle way to put it, the world is bigger than R. The data science world has more, it's very large, it's very diffuse, and R is a small part of it. It's a super important part of it that we remain committed in developing a lot of code for as a company, open source code for. But the world is bigger than R. And so RStudio rebranded to POSIT, the company, and started working on tools for doing data science. We call it code first data science. So sort of doing data science through writing code with open source tooling, but in a way that's broader than just R. Christophe was mentioning, right? Christophe was one of the original authors of R Markdown and sort of like has still working on it. But Quarto uses R Markdown, but also supports other languages and other systems.
Christophe.
Yeah, POSIT is a public benefit corporation, I would say. And so the broader mission of the company is really to create open source software for data science. So that's the company, but the mission is to create open source software, and Quarto is one of them. POSIT is doing a lot more of open source products for different ecosystems, mainly R and Python. And so they have a way to finance this mission by also developing and selling a professional product. And so that's how the machine keeps going.
Excellent point. Thank you very much for raising that, because at some stage in the development of an open source software tool, people are faced with a question, how do we continue, right? Because it might come from a research project, somebody is working on it while having another job, like, for instance, a postdoc or whatever. So this seems to be the usual route. And then the project takes off, becomes very popular, and now what? Is this how our studio started in the first place then, and then was kind of converted into POSIT? Or do you know that? I mean, we might be going a little bit further afield from Quarto now.
My understanding is the need for RStudio was envisioned before the company started. It was that JJ, the founder of POSIT, who started the Quarto project as well, but he also started RStudio, has long been interested in open source tools for data science. So his previous company was in the same space. And so he wanted to create an IDE for R that was at the quality that he thought was possible. And he started a company to do that. And so POSIT is a little bit unique, and I think we are extremely lucky to be working for the company in this way, because we are not a nonprofit, we are a for-profit company, right? So we sell some of the commercial products, you sell to make money, but the charter of the company is so that that money gets invested back into open source software. And so that's like literally written in the rules of how we need to structure the company. And so from the beginning, that has been quite a different way of funding open source, of sort of supporting it. And I think it's a very smart way to tackle the problem of maintaining long-term open source viability. Some of the products that we started developing in-house are supported just by virtue of being inside the company, right? And the way that it makes sense for the company to support Quarto is that Quarto is very well integrated in the commercial offerings that Posit sells, right? So Posit sells products like Posit Connect, Posit Workbench, the pro version of the IDE of Positron. And Quarto is, of course, built to work extremely well with these, right? Quarto is itself open source and will forever be open source. But there are things about Quarto that knows about our commercial offerings because we hold the technical control over the open source product. And so we can add those features and make sure that they work well with our commercial offerings, which means that we have the means to support Quarto as an open source product, hopefully indefinitely into the future, right? So that's the vision for how Posit chooses to support open source software.
When we talk about open source, we usually talk also about contributions from others. I don't know how many people apart from you there are in order to support Quarto and keep it running, keep the lights on. But is that enough? You probably depend on contributors as well, don't you?
I would say that we depend on contributors less than we wish we did, part from the way that the product is structured. Like it is less open to sort of feature contributions than other products because we all work together. And so it's a little bit harder to bring in other things because, for example, contributors might not know about the commercial offerings and sort of like the features that we have there and how they need to play well with one another. And so those kinds of contributions are a little bit harder. But before we even get to the like open source part of it, I should say that Quarto very importantly depends on a number of other folks that are not in this call here that work on Quarto, but not from like a software engineering role. So we have an amazing group of folks that help us both at the smallest level, like sort of write documentation for Quarto, but through the process of writing documentation, actually like use Quarto very deeply and thoughtfully and inform how Quarto is developed, right? So the developer relations team at Posit, we have a number of them that work with us. Charlotte Wickham, Isabella Velasquez, Mine Chetinkaya Rondell. Those are folks that use Quarto and teach Quarto and like write documentation for Quarto. But I consider them to be really core members of the team because they are thinking about how the documentation should be written, which affects how we write the software itself. And so in some way, we have this very fortunate situation where we get to fund folks to work on things like documentation from inside the company. And externally, we have a number of folks who do PR sort of bug fixes. I think on last count, we have 135 people who have contributed at least one merged commit to Quarto. But in some sense, that number is overstating the contributions because most of them are sort of a small number. It's like a small fix for one document or someone contributing a new language for our internationalization or those sort of smaller self-contained fixes.
That's an observation that I made by talking to other open source software projects, that there seems to be this kind of 80-20 rule that says that 80% of the major contributions seem to come from 20% or even less sometimes, in single digit numbers from contributors. So there are only very few contributors who contribute a lot, and then a lot of contributors who may be correcting one line of code and maybe only once ever. Is that the kind of thing that you see as well in Quarto?
Yeah, it's also by design of the way the project is structured because like the three of us are full-time working on Quarto.
Yeah.
It's our job to do that and not like all open source projects has this change to have like full-time contributors. And so obviously we can go quickly and deeper than like external contributors that are not like full-time on the project. So we are like maybe the 20% working on 80% of the feature. But we rely a lot on contribution, I would say. We think of contributor through PRs and like line of code, but really we rely a lot on contributions to reports. I would say issue report, like bug fixes, but also like feedbacks. And we spend a lot of time with some helps also like animating this community and getting quick answers to those feedbacks because it really helps us know what's important. It's our only metrics on how users are really using the tools. And this is really contributing to open source project. So I would really encourage people like to come in the community and help us that way. It's not only just doing PRs. And for these parts, they are the 80%, I would say.
So how can people then contribute? How does this process work? Is there a process in which people can jump on board and say, hey, I want to contribute to Quarto? How do they do that?
So we use GitHub very, very extensively for our internal planning and our sort of tracking of bugs. I would say that the vast majority of the planning, I'm using scare quotes here because I think our planning is much less structured than many other projects, but it all actually happens entirely on GitHub issues and discussions. All of those are public and in the open, so everyone can see the visibility for those. We decide, for example, which bugs and issues we'd like to fix in whatever version. Like, we try to release every 4 months or so 3 releases a year. And so we make plans for like the kinds of things we wanted to do. But all of the issues are open. And so it has been the case for a few of the bugs that we have in the past that when one of the issues were open, someone who was an expert on, in this case, was a Microsoft Word issue that we were having with tables. We got a contribution that was like fairly deep because of the way that the internal document format for Word was being generated was not working. And someone just contributed a fantastic fix that we took in like on a very specific thing, but that we would not be able to do otherwise. And so we welcome PRs is, I guess, the cliche way of saying this. But also we have a very active discussion forum on GitHub. So folks that want to talk about a larger feature, all of our discussions happen essentially in the open when we're talking about these things. And that's how one of the biggest contributions that we have from a third-party author, that's the Julia engine that I mentioned. That's how it started. Someone mentioned that it would be great if they could run Julia without having to install a bunch of other things. They were like, fantastic, we're interested. How do we go about this? They're like, we'll get started. And so we had a few meetings with them. They were fantastic. They're also supported by a company, which makes it easier. But they developed all of this, merged this, and this has been going solidly for a year in updates. And so like a big chunk of this part of Quarto is entirely external to us. So we support that as well. The main thing is that we kind of know the direction that we want the project to go. And so we talk about it open, and then folks that want to do things like that make the PRs, and then we help them get merged and so on.
Okay, so you kind of steer the conversation of what kind of contributions you would like to see. So if I'm new and I would like to contribute to, new in the sense of contributing to Quarto, how do you help people to get on board? Because it can be quite daunting. You'd like to get something done and you don't know the people behind it. You use the tool maybe a little bit. So how do you get on board?
So we have a standard in open source projects, contributing.md document, right? So this is sort of like the standard file that everyone is encouraged to read if they want to contribute to the source code, in which we sort of point out, okay, here's how we expect PRs to be. When someone creates a PR, we have one of those templates that GitHub lets you do that sort of like, have you filed the right things? Have you made sure that it passes tests? Have you added documentation to it? Have you done all these? So we have a little bit of automated work in that way. Other standard things we do is we have a label that's called good first issue on our like issues, on our bugs. And so the things that are fairly self-contained that we don't think we'll have time to get to right away, we tag with those. And so we encourage people to look at those as a first thing to fix. So it's fairly unstructured in that sense that we see folks make PRs and then we respond to them, and we more or less expect them to follow the structure of the templates and like the typical contribution. So like in that sense, it is very much an open source project. I think that the main complication is that Quarto is big and sprawly, right? So like in the beginning of our discussion, we mentioned TypeScript, Pandoc. Pandoc is written in Haskell if you want to make changes in the core of Pandoc. But Pandoc can also be extended using Lua, which is a different programming language that we use extensively. You need to know Markdown and HTML and CSS to make styles. So there's a lot of different technologies, and so it's kind of diffused in that way. And that, I think, is the main reason we get fewer contributors than you'd expect for a larger open source project like this, because folks need to know a lot of different technologies to be able to make sure that things match up.
Christophe?
I think there is also an interesting thing in Quarto is that we've made the tool extensible from the start in a way that usually in open source project, you could have some contributed PR because some user want a specific feature or want to change something. In Quarto, you can do that, add feature and tweak some default or things like that by doing Quarto extensions. And Quarto extension are a mechanism to like create custom formats, for example, adding some Lua processing to be done for Pandoc. And so you can get to a customized version or customized behavior, like for custom format for your organization or for an article by just doing an extension to Quarto that you can use. You don't need to do a PR to the base code to do that. And this is something that we designed from the start, and we plan in the future also to make even more extensible in some place that is not already, so that the way we work today can still be used for the core of the features. And then any community that could be Julia, Jupyter, R community, Python community could extend and use the tool for like its benefit. And this may not be common in all projects. And it's also why like the question of like someone doing a PR into Quarto, it's really to like make a feature or fix something that is quite tied to the base of the code, which is complicated. But extending the feature, it's easier and it can be done without contributing to the code. And sometimes, like some feature have started as an extension, and then we decided it was a really good feature, and then we've made it built-in.
Okay.
So it's a way to contribute in a way. So the built-in version was made by us, but like based on the work of someone was extended initially.
So how much of your time, or in general, how much of your time at Quarto do you need to spend on reviewing code from contributors? How much effort is involved in that?
We spend way more time on like coding, I would say, ourselves, than reviewing the others. But maintenance, it's like maintaining the community discussion, like looking at issue. It's a fair amount of time to go into that, to find the bug, because the technical complexity also is found in like when you have a bug report, it could be like really easy. It seems easy at the beginning, but if you want to find the root cause, so it's mainly that, like, and reviewing can take a lot of time if this is a big issue. So Carlos, you have the use case of this like docx feature.
So this was a PR that came externally. So we had a bug in our table rendering code. So if you want to show a table in a docx document, there are a number of limitations on how the format that you write into the docx format needs to be, or Word complains that it's a malformed document. The issue is that we can never be sure whether or not the documents we generate are perfectly safe, or they just happen to work in some cases and not the others, right? And so we were getting intermittent reports that things were broken. Sort of we can isolate them and see, yes, they are broken, but there's no great documentation from Microsoft on how all of those work. And so when we got the PR from the user, they found an external tool that someone else had written that was a validator for docx engines.
Right.
In the process of sort of taking that fix, we actually incorporated that into like our testing so that we can make sure that like if we need to check that the document is valid, we can do that. The bug fix itself was maybe 20 lines of code of change, but it was something like 3 or 4 months of interacting with the contributor. I want to say every 2 or 3 days we would exchange a message. So it wasn't like a daily thing, but there's 20 lines of code that probably took between them and us probably 50 to 70 hours of work. That doesn't show up as like constant daily reviewing of code, but just sort of like isolating and figuring out how we're going to fix it and how we're going to test in the future. I think it's probably a third, maybe more of our collective time. So it's significant. It's a lot of time to do that, which should be the case on a mature project like Quarto.
Indeed. And I never believed that the lines of code is an indication of how much time it takes. Because I do remember that I pondered on one line of code for quite some time. I think every software developer goes through that. We're coming to the end now, but before we close, I'd like to know what's ahead in the future. What do you like to do?
We mentioned earlier that Quarto integrates very deeply with Jupyter. That's how we get our Python integrated. And it's also, we support any other language that works through Jupyter notebooks. There's kind of an interesting way that the Jupyter notebooks and Quarto documents are kind of isomorphic. Like you can actually transform a Quarto document to a Jupyter notebook and back losslessly, except of course, Quarto doesn't include the results. But the way that we do it is in Quarto, anything that's outside of the cells, any markdown that's outside of the cells, we just turn into Jupyter notebook markdown cells, and then you can transfer back. So this is very powerful, but it's maybe a little bit harder for people who you're using Jupyter notebooks if they want to use that as their primary format, because you are editing the stuff that's sort of outside of cells, but you're doing it inside of cells. So I'm looking at ways to make that easier on people. The way that it transforms so nicely, it seems like there should be an easier way for Jupyter users to access all of that functionality.
Christophe.
At each version of Quarto, we try to update dependency as we can to keep update state of what we use. So this will be coming in next version, like Reveal.js update, for example. We have Bootstrap update. We are a bit late about that. So it's always things that could be tricky to do because we don't want to break past document, but we still want to be like up to date with the technology we use. There is a bit also of better work on some past tool that were not working. Like we were using, for example, Puppeteers to do some Chrome printing with Chromium, but like we have some updates to do with like Chrome changes. So we have a lot of dependencies in the project, and those dependencies don't specifically know about Quarto, so we need to adapt to them while we update. So it's a lot of work when we do for versions. So we limit at like one update per version. Usually we try to do it at the start of a version, but it's not all of them at each version. So it's quite a lot of work. I guess it will become even more work in the future as we have like more dependency and more features and things like that. And on like kind of research topic, I would say, or something we want to deal better is like you can use parameters with Quarto documents. So if you want to have like one single document and you want to do a report for the same report each month, you shouldn't have to copy the document. You should like be able to just make a parameter with the months and have your cells like query some data for that parameter. And we are currently using what's available in Nitar and Jupyter for that, but we don't have a good API. And this is something that customers also want. So this is where integration with Pro Product is important. It's a feature for open source users, but also for integration with products. So this is something we want to improve. And I'll be also working on. It may not be for the next version, maybe the one after that. But like we have some topic like that. So it's something for the future.
Many are the people who think that open source software is the very antithesis to commercial software in the sense that it's completely free. In fact, last year, 2024, I heard a presenter comparing open source software to free beer. So it still appears to surprise some people to see that you can actually run a successful business based on open source software. Of course, if you're regular at open source software conferences, such as the annual fest called FOSDEM in Brussels, this is no news at all. As I said in the interview, I downloaded and played with Quarto for a presentation myself for a bit, and if this episode made you curious, why not check it out for yourself and see how and if it works for you? You'll find the links in the show notes, as per usual. Next week, we're going to talk about something that truly scares the living daylight out of some of us, the coding interview. Something everybody who writes code for a living, whether you work in research or not, is going through at some stage in your career. But fear not, because I met just the guy who might help cracking the coding interview. In fact, he wrote a book about it, Mike Moroska. And I hope you tune in then. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.